Boethius. And the Consolation of Philosophy. So we're moving ahead about 1,000 years. AD 523, this book was written. And it does share some similarities with Socrates, who was arrested and tried. We read his trial and executed by Athens, apparently for the crime of philosophy, if we take Plato's word for it. Boethius wasn't arrested because he was a philosopher. He was arrested for a different reason. But he faced a misfortune, and in the face of that, he turns to philosophy as a source of consolation, which at least should give us pause. What do we know about Boethius? He was a Christian, and this will be the beginning of looking at Christian theism in this class and how philosophy fits with the theistic view of the Christians. He was a trained scholar. He was born in about 480 AD in Italy. He was a member of a noble family who was well off enough to send him to Athens when he was 20 to study Greek philosophy and Greek literature. He came back to Italy in about 510 AD and became a consul in the court of Theodoric, who was an Ostrogothic empire, who was in charge of at least the western part of Rome at the time. Here's a picture of Rome, and you recognize Rome, the Europe here. You can see a lot of these areas are run by Ostrogoth, Visigoths. These are German tribes who had come down and conquered Rome. Rome had moved to the east, and pretty much this is what remained of the Roman Empire as we knew it. Eventually, by about 524, Boethius runs into trouble with Theodoric, who accuses him or thinks he's part of a conspiracy against him. Theodoric has him exiled, imprisoned, and eventually put to death, probably about the year 525. So Boethius really did die. Again, he didn't die for philosophy. He died for another reason. But he finds in philosophy, just like Socrates did, a source of strength, courage, and, as he says, consolation. Here's a picture of Boethius's coffin. He is buried in a church in Pavia. And there's one of those Roman sarcophagi, funeral boxes. This holds his bones. Okay, so we're talking about somebody who really lived, who really died. Okay, and wrote a book which was a pretty famous book for its time. It's one of the most copied books throughout the Middle Ages. So we have monastic records of books that were asked to be copied. They kept track of that, and it was the highest number of copies were made of it. So a lot of people read this book and found its message, I guess, interesting. The story is, and this is, again, just a basic picture of a cell, but I imagine Boethius in a cell. Now there's two Boethiuses here, right? There's Boethius, the author, who is telling us the story, and then he's a character in his book. So he may not have actually felt this way, I don't know, but the character in the book is a little forlorn at his fate, as what's happened to him. He doesn't feel like he's a bad man, doesn't feel like he deserves what's been happening to him. And Lady Philosophy, so philosophy in the personification of a woman, appears to him. And in a sense, gives him what for, saying, you kind of were trained for this, you know better than this. She's going to work with him to come to see how he should be thinking about himself in his life in terms of what's happened to him. Some depictions of Lady Philosophy, these are rather more formal depictions. Lady Philosophy is described as having a crown. Both these pictures have crowns, of being, well, she was shabbily dressed, and these ones show her as not being so shabbily dressed. But, you know, they've got her. She had a scepter in hand. She had a P and a th, a theta on her um, on her robe, I guess, or her dress. And she finds Boethius in his cell, being ministered by the muses, who she chases off. And so poetry is not the solution here. Sort of weeping or crying or playing sad music. Philosophy, she says, is really your only source of consolation here. Here's another picture of Lady Philosophy, a little more simplified. Here she has a lute. You know, in the Consolation of Philosophy, they go back and forth between prose and poetry sections. Sometimes in the book, it says that Lady Philosophy is singing this poetry. Finally, here's really far on now. This one, at least, we've got the tattered rags, but not even maybe enough to cover her. Okay, Boethius is sitting there. He looks a little more like Job to me, if you're familiar with the book of Job in the Bible. So the project from book one is this. There's two questions that philosophy sees has to be answered. So the big question, and this is a philosophical question, how can we be happy in this life, especially if we face misfortune? This will be the topic of books 2 and books 3. And then a related question, why do the evil prosper and the good fail? Question of problem of evil. Here's an overview of what's to come in the book, Boethius' situation, the setup. Fortune is discussed in book 2, and then human happiness takes on the theme of book 3. And then book 4 sort of comes back at book 3 with a problem. If we're right about how human happiness is going to be achieved, why is there evil? And book 5 has to do with free will. We're not going to actually look at book 5 in this class, but feel free to go ahead and read that on your own if you want to. I think the big question, though, we should keep in mind here is, can philosophy be a consolation? How is philosophy a consolation? How is philosophizing going to help anybody? So food for thought. What are your typical responses that you've heard to setbacks and troubling events in your life? How do you respond? How do other people respond? How have you been told to respond? How well do these responses work? And have you ever considered philosophy as a response to setbacks? And what do you think that means, to see philosophy as a source of consolation, as a source of strength in times of trouble? The next step we'll look at a brief video about Boethius' Consolation and the message, and then we'll look at the arguments of book 2 and book 3.